Hey folks, Rob Avis here. We just finished putting up our solar array. You can see it in the background there. And that solar array is 5 kilowatts. And I was just eating dinner and looking outside the window, and there's that big honking beast of a tractor right there. And so I was thinking, man, you know, even though that array looks pretty big in relation to that solar array, that tractor is about 40, let me just look it up here. I just looked it up. Let's make sure I get the numbers right. I was just looking up this tractor, and on tractor data, it's a 3010 John Deere. And yeah, right. So it runs at about 52.77 horsepower, or about 39.4 kilowatts. So to put that into perspective, that tractor puts out a peak power of 6 times that array. And to give you an idea of size, just a second here. So that's how big this is. And this is how big this is. So with the farm that we bought, we got a whole bunch of equipment, plus we had our vehicles. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna line up all the vehicles in front of the solar array, and I'm gonna talk about how many kilowatts of peak power each of the vehicles puts out individually. Why am I doing this? Well, because I think it's time that you and I have a discussion about peak oil and why it's such a big deal. And we've kind of forgotten about it amongst this COVID thing, but it's coming, and it doesn't really matter if it's next year. It kind of matters if it's next year, but it matters just as much if it's 20 years from now, because replacing that or the vehicles that I'm going to show you is really challenging, and it's going to take a lot more of those to replace them than we think it will. And I'm absolutely for the electric economy. I think we're going to have to go there. We don't really have a choice, but how we get there is worth the conversation. So let's get the cars in front, the vehicles in front, the engines in front, and then let's talk about how many of those arrays it would take to replace each one of those vehicles. And then we can talk a little bit about peak oil and the solutions to this incredibly massive problem. All right, so I've laid out all these engines in terms of smallest to largest, and I'm gonna put myself in that line. And the engine on, I guess, your left, my right, yeah, is a chainsaw. And if you think of a human as an engine, where do you think I'm gonna end up in this line? It's pretty obvious, hopefully. So I'm going to go through there with a post-it note, and I'm going to put its horsepower and its equivalent in kilowatts. So horsepower is kind of imperial units, and it's equivalent to 745 watts per horsepower. And a horsepower is just the power of a horse. And so I'm going to put the horsepower, I'm going to put the number of kilowatts or watts, and I'm also going to relate it to the number of humans that it's equivalent to in terms of output of power. And then we're going to end up talking a little bit about the solar array in terms of what that would be equivalent to, and why that means that peak oil is a really big deal and that we need to be thinking about it today. We should have been thinking about it 30 years ago, and now we're going to end up with a giant, likely we're going to end up with a giant problem if it comes when we least expect it. So let's put these post-it notes on there, and then you'll get a sense of how these different components vary. I went around and I labeled all the vehicles. And I put the vehicles in order of largest to smallest. And so the first vehicle is an absolute beast. Now I'm sure you're not used to somebody telling you that a Honda Pilot is an absolute beast of a machine, but it is. Let me tell you why. So this machine is 250 horsepower or 186.25 kilowatts of peak power, which is equivalent to 1,862.5 humans. So if you think about that, if you were going to replace this engine with human power, it would take 1,862 of us to put out the equivalent amount of horsepower that this thing puts out. That's unbelievable. You know, I'm gonna probably be driving to Calgary in a couple of days from now, and I'm gonna take this because I gotta pull a trailer. And I would have to be running somewhere between, it probably won't be operating at peak when it's on the highway, but it won't be far off. It'll probably be 2/3 of peak. And so that would be like 1,000 humans running at full bore in order to make this thing go at 100 kilometers an hour. Okay, and just keep in mind the solar array behind me is 5 kilowatts. This one was 186 kilowatts. Next in the roster is this beast. And again, you wouldn't think of a Honda Fit as a beast, but this guy here has the equivalent of, I don't know if you can see that, 128 horsepower or 95 kilowatts, which is the equivalent of 953 humans. So to make this thing go at 100 kilometers an hour and run the AC is equivalent to almost 1,000 humans. And again, if it was 2/3, call it 750. Enormous amount of power. And this is possible because of gasoline or diesel or whatever fuel you're burning, but most likely it's gasoline or diesel. Even a Tesla requires an enormous amount of energy. They are a lot more efficient than these things. I should say that electric motors are about 3 to 4 times more efficient than a gasoline engine in terms of how they utilize energy. Like only about 20% of the gasoline that goes into this car will actually move it forward, and only about 1 to 3% of that energy is actually going to be used to propel me. An electric motor, on the other hand, uses almost 100% of the energy that's stored in its vehicle to propel that vehicle forward, because electric motors are so efficient. And so realistically that means anywhere from 6 to 12% of that energy in a Tesla would go to moving the humans. So it's better, but it's still a lot of energy. Now this beast here, an old 3010 John Deere tractor, is a whopping 52 horsepower, which is pretty small in terms of today's tractors on farms. That's equivalent to 38 kilowatts. And a whopping 387 humans. Now, we're lucky because we're designing our farm from scratch. And while we're doing that, I've been relying pretty heavily on this tractor. It's done a lot of work for me, and it's gonna do a lot of work to set the farm up. But every time I turn this thing on, now I'm gonna think, man, that's like 380 some humans running this thing in order to get all this other work done. And this is kind of what got me to do this video today, because I was looking at it, I was looking at all the fence posts that I've got to put into the ground and thinking, oh my gosh, this farm has to be a demonstration of what a fossil fuel free or very low fossil fuel input farm needs to be. Because if our farms are going to rely on these guys, and I'm not saying that we won't have tractors and we won't have machines, they're probably going to be electric ones, but keep in mind, this was 38 kilowatts, this machine at peak power. That solar array is 5, which means that it would take 6 of those solar arrays in terms of output to equate to the power that this thing can put out. Now that's not totally an equivalent comparison, because that array will sit there and generate 5 kilowatts as long as the sun is out. So on a good summer day you might get 10 hours, that's 50 kilowatt hours. So if this array in one day could produce 50 kilowatt hours in the summer, that would run this machine at peak capacity for about an hour and a half. So electricity and energy and power gets confusing for most people, which is why I wanted to make this video, and we'll make more videos about energy. But what I'm saying basically is that most summer days with sun, this array, if it ran all day long and put all of its power into a battery powered tractor of this size, I'd get 1.5 hours of productive time in this tractor with the amount of energy this thing could produce, given current efficiency. Now I'm sure new tractors are a little bit more efficient for all the reasons that we just mentioned, but I wanted to make this video to kind of give you an equivalency between what that system costs, or the amount of space that it takes, and how much energy this system consumes, and how reliant we are on these types of systems and vehicles in order to make our properties work. Let's keep going down the list. Now this guy came with the farm. It's a 400cc or 26 horsepower side-by-side, which is about 19 kilowatts or 198 humans. So when you're tooling around the farm on your side-by-side, that's equivalent to almost 200 humans pulling you around, consuming that fossil fuel energy in order to do whatever you're doing. And so permaculture uses this concept of zonation, and zonation is basically the appropriate location of elements to reduce the amount of energy exuded on a farm in order to achieve a certain end. Work is a failure in design. And so we have things like this that we can turn on in an instant and engage all of that energy and not think about the importance of getting appropriate locations set up. Let's go down the list. Okay, so this is our lawn tractor, and it's 25 horsepower, 18.6 kilowatts, or 186 humans. And so our desire to cut the lawn and keep grass short is incredibly energy intense. I mean, imagine having 186 humans running around on treadmills or whatever, trying to get this thing to cut the grass. Unreal. And people do it all the time. And this one absolutely blew my mind. So this is one of my favorite chainsaws. It's a Husqvarna 445. It's 2.8 horsepower or 2 kilowatts of energy, which is equivalent to about 20 humans. Unreal. So when I'm cutting down a tree, that'd be equivalent to having 20 humans right beside me cutting that tree down with me. Because the final element in this is me. And so I'm about 1/8 of a horsepower. If I'm, busting my butt as hard as I can, about 100 watts of energy or 1 incandescent light bulb. And that's why it takes so much human power in order to be able to recreate what these gasoline engines come from. So now let's talk a little bit about the solar array. So this solar array is 5 kilowatts. You'll notice it's on a tilt angle, or the ability to have it tilted at different angles depending on the time of year. And so we can change it as the sun changes orientation in the sky. And so this is equivalent to about 50 humans of power. And this is why I think everybody should get solar. If you're worried about peak oil, if you're worried about what the world looks like when we take away all of these free laborers, basically, the world looks really hard. The world looks really difficult when you take away fossil fuel. Everything that we've become accustomed to, just being able to hop in a car and go at 100 kilometers an hour, or start up a rototiller and get a garden prepared, or cut the lawn, or dry our clothes, or wash our clothes. All of these things take enormous amounts of energy, and we don't even think about it. And if that energy gets removed from us without us being aware that we're even consuming it, the world is literally going to fall apart. And this is something that I've been concerned about since I was working in the oil and gas industry, and one of the main reasons that I left the oil and gas industry to pursue what I do now. The world is changing. COVID has raised a lot of the fragilities that we need to be concerned about, except that it's being masked, literally and figuratively, by other concerns. And I'm not here to take sides on COVID, but what I will tell you is that there are multiple enormous black swans lurking right behind COVID, and one of them is our energy, and it implicates how we eat, how we heat our homes, how we drink water. When the power went out for this thing, for 2 hours to hook it up, we had no water because we live on well water, right? This is just a reality in rural areas. And in a city, yes, the water system would have a backup generator, but how long would that last for? And so we are so dependent on energy, and life will be absolutely, completely different without it. And it's totally, you can totally live without energy, but the reality of getting from here to there is something that most people haven't contemplated. So I would encourage you to improve your energy literacy, which is why I did this video, and start thinking about how you're going to live in a world with much less energy. I think these things are a reality. I think that they will be part of our life, but replacing all of these engines and all the fuel that they consume with solar is not going to be a reality. It's going to require us to design things better. We're going to have to create designs that use less energy in general. We're going to have to rely more on human energy. The things that are absolutely critical, like tractors maybe, like cars perhaps, will move to battery-powered options, but we're generally going to have less energy to go around. The energy return on energy invested of these solar panels is about 6 to 1, which means that every unit of energy that goes into it, you get about 6 out. And I'm sure that that's improving as the efficiency increases. But to put that in perspective, Saudi Arabian oil 100 years ago was putting out anywhere from 1,000 to 1 to 20,000 to 1, meaning that for every barrel of oil they injected into finding oil, they'd get 1,000 to 20,000 out. Those days are gone. The surplus of energy is not coming back, not in that scale anyways, which means we're going to have to learn to do more with less, and we're going to also have to change our behaviors and our expectations. And this is something that North Americans are really going to struggle with, because we've been taught that there's always enough to go around, that we can just use as much as we want. And this fundamentally is where the zombie apocalypse myth comes from. The zombie apocalypse myth is not that there's actually going to be zombies, but that the average person that hasn't contemplated the hardships that are going to come with peak oil, or a food collapse, or a pandemic, or any number of situations which most people are wholesale unprepared for, will create enormous amounts of angst and anger and frustration and depression. And as a result of it, people stop thinking and they start working in mobs. And so the solution to this is not preparation and prepping. The solution to this is conscientious design and taking responsibility for our actions and starting to understand the repercussions of our actions and how to improve our own situation so that when these things happen, that we are prepared. And in fact, the more people that take these actions in their life, the more people that take responsibility and understand the repercussions of the decisions that they make on a daily basis, the less likely these black swans are to occur in the future. It's our ignorance that actually exposes us most to these massive black swans. The world's a volatile place. It always will be. The only solution is to understand that the world is a volatile place and there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and to figure out what sorts of things you have the ability to manipulate in your life to make that volatility much more palatable. And that's the essence of what we've been talking about on this channel. It's the essence of Nassim Taleb's book Anti-Fragile and The Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness, and many other books that I've read on similar subjects. And this is one of the main reasons that I teach permaculture design. I teach design because I don't want to have zombies as neighbors. I want to have people that are conscientiously designing their life, making their communities better, and fundamentally finding decentralized ways to meet their supply chains of food, energy, water, shelter, and community. So thanks so much for listening to my rant today. Hopefully you found it useful. If there's anything else that I didn't describe that you're interested in energy, leave it in the comment section below. And I'll keep making videos like this in the future around energy and energy literacy, peak oil, and why I think it's important that we don't lose sight of what's coming down the pipeline. Okay, see you guys in the next video.